Okay, guys. So where we are now, we're going to go through modules 3 and 4. Most of this, I think, is going to be fairly straightforward. We're going to go through the basic ideas and then move on a little bit from that there. Now, of course, the very first thing, very simple question: what is a scientific model? And so, essentially, what we're going to be talking about here is, what is a model? Model simply is doing a couple of things there. You're illustrating, simplifying, representing, and basically you're trying to make any scientific concept easier to understand. Now, you can go from the easy to understand. Some models also try and make predictions. So the modern scientific model, because essentially most modern scientific models use some form of interactivity, they use some form of computer aided for the most part. So an example here would be computer modeling of climate conditions. One of the things you do there, the model tries to replicate some of the stuff in the past and then allows you to try and predict what is going to happen in the future. And sometimes it's very difficult. You've got to realize some models are going to be simpler than the actual thing there, and we'll look at some examples there. Some models are very expensive to run as well. Okay, so there's a lot of factors that go into this. Okay, now of course we do know our 5 main things here. And of course the first one is the diagram. And diagram is just anything that's trying to explain how to do something. So here is just a really simple scientific diagram, which is how you would set up an experiment. Now, of course, you can see here, there is a couple of tiny little problems with this diagram, which is why it's got a little red X there. And I think what you're talking about here is essentially the red X is saying you probably should be listing the tripod and Y gauze the other way around so that they're not crossing over, because you want your model to represent what you're doing and make it simple. Now, of course, here, a lot of scientific diagrams use stylized symbols like this one here. Y gauze is always that little wavy thing. The tripod's always those 3 lines. It's just to make it easy when people are trying to look at it. You can also have physical replicas. And so what we've got here, which we'll see in a second hopefully, is basically just the spring. Now we look at examples of a wave model, just using the little wave model here. But you can see here, this is representing how waves move. This doesn't necessarily, that's not how all waves move. But this allows you to understand that a wave is just energy moving through something. And it's either moving through a medium or it can be moving through space or anything like that. It's just a way of representing an idea. Now, we can also go on to mathematical representations. And mathematical representations, particularly in physics and chemistry, are the main places you are going to get those representations. And this one here, we talked about Isaac Newton, I think a little bit earlier, talking about gravity. And in this case here, this is Newton's universal law of gravitation. Those of you doing physics next year will become familiar with this. Looks like a big formula, it's actually not. And essentially you've just got there that the force of gravity between 2 objects depends on the mass of the 2 objects, the distance between the 2 objects, and this magical constant G, which is just a number in the universe, a little bit like the law of gravity is or the pull due to gravity on Earth is 9.8 meters per second squared. But all it's doing is representing something that happens in the world. And it allows you to mathematically, quantitatively work out what's going on around it. Fairly straightforward. You also have analogies. And we've said this a few times before, an analogy is just a way of trying to understand something by something else that's familiar. Now, this analogy is getting a bit dated because there's not many of you and not many people that actually have film cameras or cameras like that anymore. But essentially, your eye operates like a camera. Light comes in through a lens, hits the retina, which is similar to what used to happen in film cameras. Most cameras now have charge coupled devices, which kind of work a little bit the same, but not exactly. Now, you can also have computer simulations. Now, here is a computer simulation of, I think it's air temperatures and how air temperatures change. Now, models like this are important for understanding how things happened in the past, but also for predicting the future. Computer simulations as well allow you to analyze data really quickly. If you think about it, some of you would have used some of the online simulations for science. There's tons of them out there, but they all use mathematical backgrounds. You think about it here, Newton, when he was working out gravity, all he had was bits of paper and a bit of mathematics. Didn't even have a calculator. Probably had some logarithmic tables or something like that. But you guys have this power that you can actually manipulate things really, really easily. Now, going back, there's a couple more examples here, and we've already seen a few of these examples today. Epidemic models. Okay, this is how models can be used in real life situations. This is the model, some of the modeling that was used earlier this year when COVID hit. And the red line is an example of what the modeling showed would happen if 70% of people didn't follow social distancing laws. No, well, look, so sorry, if 30% do not. So one of the things with the social distancing is that places like New South Wales, probably pretty early, we followed those things quite easily. So if 70% complied, the cases would have gone up. This modelling was used to show that you need at least 80% of people to follow those rules. Now, that kind of happened in New South Wales, definitely has happened in the other states. Victoria, probably you had those 70% of people following it. You had 30% of the population down there was pretty stupid. And that's why Victoria took off. There was a lot of other factors there as well. But this is modelling. And this shows that in any epidemic, now this is COVID data, that data will be the same for any form of epidemic. The only difference is that COVID is, it basically spreads quicker than other diseases, but the diseases the modelling for any disease is going to be very, very similar to that anyway. We have models of the universe. Now we have a whole heap of them here. Down the bottom right there is contemporary cosmology. Essentially the universe is kind of expanding. There's no center to the universe. You go all the way up to the top left, there's a Chinese model, which has got a flat Earth. Now, if I was teaching this to you in the US, some of you would be yelling at me now because for some reason Americans think the flat Earth is correct. Well, and America has the highest amount of COVID-related diseases, so you can take that data as you wish there. But you go back to that Guy Tian model there, the early Chinese one. You've also got there, have I got that one there? There's no turtles there, I don't think. You know, some of the ancient ideas. But the flat Earth makes common sense. It's wrong, but it makes common sense. Then you've got another Chinese model that we're actually a sphere floating in water, the more flat Earth. The Egyptians said that the sky was some chick bending over another chick, and the air was a guy holding it up. The ancient Babylonian one, I'm not going to comment on what that looks like. But you know, all these different ideas. Now, one of the things there is these are just ideas. It's only when you get down to here, you've got Plato here in sort of the middle right, where they started quantifying it because they're saying, well, okay, despite what Americans and flat earthers think, people in general have considered the Earth to be a sphere for thousands of years. The ancient Greeks said, yeah, it's a sphere. It's pretty obvious it's a sphere. You're stupid if you don't believe that. And so that's been around for a while. It's just where that sphere was seated. With nothing else, there was no technology, there was no telescopes, there was nothing to disprove the idea. You assume that this is the center of the universe. The stars going around. You had a guy, Aquinas, he was a well-known Roman emperor, not a Roman emperor, Roman Catholic priest who came with a lot of scientific ideas. Then eventually you get to Copernicus. And Copernicus, and then you get Tycho Brahe, that there. Thanks to the work of Galileo, worked out the sun is probably the center of at least our localized universe, our localized solar system. And eventually, with Hubble's help, we worked out that there is no center to the universe. Everything is moving apart from each other. And if you want to go into space and time, they're stretching and moving away from each other. Now, you also have here a couple of other models that we've looked at a fair amount. And we'll go past that there. We don't need to already talked about that. Atomic models. Now, we've talked about this a few times, and the idea is our modern atomic theory is just over 200 years old. Electricity is only about 150 years old. A lot of our modern world is actually very, very modern. But it was only in 1803 that John Dalton actually came up with that idea that there were atoms. Prior to that, it was still thought that things were pretty much divisible continually. You could keep cutting stuff in half. There's I think it was one of the Greek philosophers said, get a piece of cheese, cut it in half, then cut that in half, then cut that in half, then cut that in half. The atomic model says eventually you get to a bit of cheese that you can't cut any further. That doesn't mean there are cheese atoms. It was just a nice little analogy to go through that. And then with it really, then took 100 years. J.J. Thomson, this plum pudding, then Ernest Rutherford with the orbital model, then Niels Bohr, Erwin Schrödinger. The atomic theory is an idea that developed as technology was able to develop pretty quickly. Science is littered with areas where technology has helped this move forward. Now, we can also have a look here, climate models. Climate models have changed drastically. One, because if you try and look at anything to do with the climate on a worldwide basis, it is almost impossible to do without really powerful computing equipment there. So if in the mid-70s, you said, okay, there's rain, there's surface, carbon dioxide. Our climate models now, it's not just about carbon dioxide, there's methane, water vapor. When data becomes available after all the COVID stuff this year, you'll probably find that global temperatures have reduced a little bit because there's a 3-month period there at the start of the year where basically no one traveled much. One of the biggest greenhouse emitters is air travel. That's pretty much stopped for the foreseeable future. So climate modeling will actually probably have to change again for that. And of course here, what you've got here is another little thing here. This is a little bit of a graph that shows the observations of average temperatures. You can tell this has come from the US because it's in Fahrenheit, but don't worry about the temperature there, just worry about the pattern. Average temperatures have gone up. They are still going up. Over the next 2 years, they'll probably plateau, possibly even go backwards slightly. But the modeling suggests that if there was human effects, it'd go up. Natural forces, it stays the same. Now, of course, one of the things with modeling as well, you can say, well, maybe that's wrong. You'd have to look at the underlying data, but that's beyond what we need to do right now. Now, question for you to think about, and this might be something that you're asked to do in an exam. Are those previous models effective? And you've got to think about, why are they effective? So have a think there. Which model of those do you think was the most effective? You just say any of them, doesn't matter. Or which do you think is the easiest model to understand out of those ones? The epidemic model? What were you guys saying at the back? Say it aloud. Atomic model. Okay. Now, why was the atomic model relatively easy to understand? What could you relate it to? Plum pudding. So that was Dalton's thing there. But even the orbital model of Rutherford, it's the idea of things orbiting something is actually quite an easy concept to understand. And that's probably how you assess the effectiveness of a model. Can it relate to people's experiences? One of the problems with, particularly this year, with climate modelling is hard to understand because it takes into account a lot of effects. The COVID modelling from this year was really hard to understand for a lot of people because it was outside of their normal thing. And particularly early on, people were saying, oh, it's just like the flu, people just get a bit sick and then we'll move on with our lives. Then all of a sudden, people started dying, and that's it. Sarita and Suclean. No. Yeah, try in lab 4 and 5. Okay. So what you've got to do, you might be presented with a model, and you might be asked to assess its effectiveness. One, the two things I think you really need to think about with a model: does it explain the concept, and can you make predictions from it? If you can do both of those, it's a really effective model. And in saying that, not every model has to actually do that either. Now, one of the things there, very important part of Module 3, is the fact that you guys yourselves went in there and actually built your own model. And so one of the things there, if you're going through and doing your own model, you've got to think about it as well. One of the things through all the digital portfolios and all the stuff I read there, the models that we thought were the best were the ones that showed a lot of self-reflection. That showed and said, this is an effective model because of this, because of that. Now, we've also got here this idea of the law of conservation of mass pops in a lot. You'll notice here that we didn't spend a lot of time on models because you guys spent a lot of time doing that yourself. But really important concept in science is this idea of theories and laws. And the one overarching thing that's combining the two of them is this idea of the conservation law of mass and of energy. Now, the first one here, for you to understand the law of conservation of mass, what sort of model have we got there? Diagram. You could also do this using a physical model, because that diagram there represents what happens with molecular model kits. You could do this one of two ways. You could either do it as the diagram and that there. But what this effectively shows you is it uses a visual representation. Uses the idea that, okay, I can see that on the left-hand side, even though one of they're kind of hidden, there's 1 carbon, there's 4 hydrogens, and there are 4 oxygen atoms. In this case here, it's showing a complete reaction where you get some CO2 and some water. This is showing you why the law of conservation of mass has to occur. Because for that diagram there to be effective, all those bits of matter, the matter just doesn't go anywhere. So it still stays there. And Lavoisier was the guy who first promoted that idea. And in a chemical reaction, things just rearrange. Prior to Lavoisier, there was still a bit of debate about whether things could come in and out of existence, but this showed that it basically, the matter's there, just changes from one thing to another. Plate tectonics is another one there. This is another sort of theory in geology. So we just looked at the law of conservation of mass. This is the theory of geology. Okay, and you see that it explains how the plates move over time. You can also see at the top there, that animation there is essentially a computer model of how it thought those tectonic boundaries moved around. And we also, when was this idea accepted? It was closer to the 1970s it was accepted. A bit earlier than that. I think it was about 1970. Or I could be wrong. Good to see you're paying attention. But Alfred Wegener proposed this in the 1912. It was around 1912, I think he promoted the sort of that bit there. And it's an idea where the theory wasn't accepted for a very, very, very long time. Now, one thing here, we've got some definitions. A theory is just an idea. A theory explains how something happens. And we'll go over some of the ideas, theories, and laws there. But this is the really interesting thing here. And this is the thing that if you do nothing else to this course, get out of this. When someone says, I'm talking about a scientific theory, they're not making a guess. People out in the wider community think every time someone says the theory of plate tectonics, the theory of evolution, Big Bang theory, they say, oh, what you're saying is just a theory. They're misusing the word theory. Theory, it means an explanation. They really should be talking about a hypothesis. Okay, a hypothesis is a guess. A theory is an explanation. And it's really important to make sure that you keep that in your heads. Which is, of course, also contrasted with a law. A law states what happens. So if we use those examples here, the law of conservation of mass is that mass is not created or destroyed, it just changes in a reaction, or the atoms rearrange themselves in an atom. Matter is not created, it's not destroyed. The theory behind that is that atoms are rearranged. So the law tells you what happens, the theory tells you why. So as I was trying to say there in atomic theory, the theory of the law of conservation is that all matter is made of atoms. Atoms are small, indivisible particles that in a chemical reaction rearrange themselves. Any leftover material has to react with something else, so nothing's left behind. The law states what happens, the theory tells you how it happens or why it happens. In plate tectonics, what you have there is, there's no real law of plate tectonics, it's just theory. It just says the surface of the Earth is divided into large masses, plates that are masses of hard rock. At the continents, those bits of rock are thick, and in the ocean, they're thin, and there's convection currents in the upper mantle that allow these plates to move around. Okay, really, really important to get that there. So laws, theories are all linked by hypotheses, or hypotheses. I can never get the plural of that right. Someone with better English than me can probably work that out. But you can have a hypothesis. It can become a law if it's been tested over and over again. Now, this all relates back, yeah? Is almost always true. As you can see, I've just taken that definition from offline. It's probably better to say is always true, particularly when so for something to become a law, it's got to be definitive. There are more laws in physics and chemistry, because in physics and chemistry, things are either right or wrong. When you get into biology and geology, things get a bit wishy-washy. So I think that's where the almost comes about, because it's hard, because really in geology and biology, it's sometimes hard to do a definitive independent dependent variable experiment, particularly in geology, where most of geology is just looking back. It's still scientific, it's just looking at it from a different point of view. Okay. So as I said before, this is just summarizing. A law describes what happens, the theory explains why it happens. So, and it's really important to remember that bit about theory. A theory is not a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a completely different thing. Okay. Now, oh, you can see there I've made a very silly spelling mistake. I don't know how that happened. Just ignore that. Just put the T in there yourself. So what we got here, what leads to a theory being developed? So when we come to germ theory, and so germ theory, next year when you guys are doing biology, or some of you are doing biology, you'll learn about Co or Cock, depends on, I think he was Danish or something. I think you got to put a real into his name. Are there any people from those Nordic countries that can correct me here? Those of you who are like art will probably know that if you talk about Van Gogh, you're actually supposed to say Van Gogh. I had a guy in Amsterdam tell me that once. But what you've got there, theory being developed. In this case here, the postulates refer to what definitions of a disease. And so in this case here, there's a whole heap of rules that you have to have before something's classed as a disease. In this case here, you can see there, those unfortunate rats have become the subjects of a few things because they breed really, really quickly. But germ theory, we go all the way back to module 1 and 2 when we were talking about John Snow. John Snow made observations. Those observations were tested, and by being tested, they were then proven to be true. And then they kept on developing that over time. You also have Lavoisier's oxygen theory of combustion. And so a little bit there, but essentially, Lavoisier was pretty much one of the first, he basically discovered oxygen. And by doing that, there was able to show that oxygen was an important part of particularly combustion, but also oxidization and corrosion experiments as they go on there. Did a lot of experiments with mercury, because for some reason burning mercury from a chemical point of view, you release oxygen. Probably also released a lot of mercury gas. So I can't remember how he died, but he may have gone nuts. You also have there, one of the key things, this is a really important thing here, and this is where some of the flat earth people do get a bit funny when they talk about disproving theories, because the theories have been disproven in the past. So one there, geocentric theory. Okay, that's your original geocentric model. Theories can be overturned if there's new evidence. So when people like Galileo, Tycho Brahe, Copernicus looked into the sky, they saw things that didn't match the geocentric theory. Main one being planets like Mercury and Venus and Jupiter and Mars, which are very easy to see in the sky, didn't follow the regular pattern. And by not following that regular pattern, they had to come up with a new idea. That new idea, which was the heliocentric model, the sun-centered model, explains everything there much better. In that case there, one theory was overturned and replaced by a new theory. Now, the heliocentric and geocentric theory have very similar ideas. They've just got one part that's completely different, which is what is the center. Then we go to the theory of inheritance by acquired characteristics. In the 1800s, for the most part, it was accepted that there was evolution going on. Evolution was accepted. In the 1700s and 1800s, a whole heap of new fossils had been discovered. And particularly, is it Mary Anning, who's credited with discovering dinosaur fossils? Someone can tell me if I'm wrong eventually. But the discovery of dinosaur fossils suggested there were things in the past that aren't around today. And that suggested that animals and plants and things like that change over time. Lamarck's idea was essentially that you change over your life. You start off as little, you grow up big. Sometimes you grow bigger, sometimes you grow smaller, sometimes you grow bits of your body more. Like if you're a Arnold Schwarzenegger type, you're building up your muscles. According to Lamarck's theory, any children Arnold has should have all these muscles. Now, that you got to say, that was competing with Darwinism at the time. It's been shown that that's not the case. The reasons for that, you guys would know, is because, okay, genetic traits, you've got a phenotype, you've got a genotype. That's only knowledge that's 50 years old. Mendel discovered that with his peas, but until we could actually work out the shape of DNA, that couldn't actually be worked. Darwin's theory, Lamarck's theory was disproven. A better theory came along. And that's the idea of scientific theories. Whatever theories we have today can easily be overturned tomorrow if something better explains it. Now, we also have Dalton's atomic theory, and going back to Dalton's, I think his first law was called the law of definitive proportions. And so he worked out that if you had water and you were able to pass electricity through it and you could actually separate the gases, you would always get 2 parts hydrogen to 1 part oxygen. And so that was this law of definitive proportions. Dalton's atomic theory, although he said it was all indivisible. What overturned Dalton's theory? It's law of conservation of mass still works with this theory. Yeah, Thomson came along and discovered technology was the impact. The technology at the time was a thing called a cathode ray tube. And the cathode ray tube showed that inside atoms, there was this negative thing that eventually became called the electron. Now, it's probably wrong to say Dalton's idea was disproven. It was just improved upon. Dalton's idea was true for the technology they had at the time. And that's a really important thing, that technology allows ideas to be overtaken. And of course, you also have our final one here is this idea of the steady state theory. Now, the steady state theory is basically saying the universe is pretty much the same wherever you look, and it's always going to look that way. In the steady state theory, essentially what you're saying there, the universe just stays the same, even when it is expanding. If you accept that it's an expanding universe, steady state says, well, matter just comes into existence. Everything stays the same over time. Big Bang, Hubble's observations of redshift in galaxies and that showed that there was something else going on. And this is a very important thing. These aren't stupid ideas. They're just ideas that are part of the development. There's ideas that scientists believe now that in 100 years' time, a class could be sitting here and saying, well, why did those idiots 100 years ago believe that? That's stupid. Technology and knowledge changes over time. It's just what happens. Now, scientific laws. We're going to go through a few examples here of the laws. Now, most of these, I think you kind of work pretty easily. You've got an idea of most of them. Newton's second law. Does anyone remember the mathematical formula for it? Force is equal to mass times acceleration. F is equal to ma. I think the better way of doing it is A is equal to F over m. Because what it's saying there is that the amount of acceleration depends on the relationship between the force and the mass. And the example I always use is that, you know, if you break down a set of traffic lights, would you prefer to be pushing a semi-trailer or a little VW? Probably the VW. One, it's going to take you less time to do that because it's a smaller mass. And it's a pretty easy one to work out there. Now, the reason this is accepted is because every single experiment done has shown that it occurs. It's a law because it's always been shown to be true. And I know we had that definition before, which said in most cases, this is very much a physics example. Physics operates on it either works or there's something weird going on. And when some of you do physics and you learn about Einstein's law ideas, they overturn something that wasn't working. Those of you who are doing chemistry next year will learn about Avogadro in some way, shape or form. Avogadro's law, the main thing there is that if you have a volume of gas and it's got the same temperature, it's the same pressure, there'll be the same number of molecules in there. Okay, so it's just standard temperature and pressure gas laws. And when you do some stoichiometry, when you do chemistry, that'll be fun for you. Law of superposition. Okay. We've talked about this a few times. It pops up a fair amount. And it's a pretty simple one for you to work out that, you know, if everything is equal and nothing weird has happened, then the lower layer of rock is always going to be older. It's relatively straightforward. And finally, our old friend Mendel, a monk doing all these peace stuff, and essentially worked out. Well, someone tell me, what was Mendel's law of dominance? Okay, you don't have to boringly read it out. Essentially, the main one there is the law of dominance, essentially that organisms have a pair of traits and one of those traits can be dominant. And he worked that out, that green peas were dominant over yellow. I think it was smooth peas were dominant over wrinkled peas. Tall stalks and shorts. A lot of these things, a lot of your dominant recessive traits usually refer to color or size. Now, of course, peas was a good example. You've also got to be very careful that particularly in higher organisms like mammals, it's not one pair of genes that controls your hair or anything like that. It's groups of genes. It's a little bit more complex. I always do like the story of Mendel though, because he worked out basically the laws of genetics without actually understanding what was happening. And so that's probably why it's pretty easy to call it a law. It just says what happens. A dominant gene will be expressed over a recessive gene. It took about 200 years for the discovery of DNA to actually work out why Mendel's laws actually occurred. Now, one of the things there you might be asked to do is, we definitely did the Ohm's law experiment. We glossed over a bit of the law of conservation one of energy because we were sort of trying to get through that there. But you might be asked to outline an experiment you did to prove a law. I think we did a bit of Ohm's law last year anyway, going through the year 9 and 10 course, but we did it here this year as well. Thank you. And the idea is that you did an experiment which actually showed that the law is expressed. And you didn't really get anything that showed anything any different. Now, here's a tricky question. The reason the law of conservation of energy is given such predominance in the course is because it's a law that is applied in every one of the main scientific areas. How's it applied in chemistry? This is the easiest one. Yep, balancing of equations. You know, you can say, you know, the amount of energy on this side here. You could also bring in as physics as well, the law of thermodynamics, you know, energy. It's actually quite easy in some chemistry experiments to actually measure the energy before and the energy after, particularly if you're dealing with heat. What about in physics? What's that? Yeah, I did. I thought you might be able to come up with something better there. Year 11 course in physics has a lot of stuff on thermodynamics, but also we talk about, you know, we've done stuff on kinetic energy, stored energy. You guys, in terms of just basic energy ideas, you have an idea of what's going on there. And essentially, the energy before an interaction and energy afterwards. When you start doing some kinematics in physics next year, you do talk about the fact that energy can move from potential to kinetic, and then if you have an elastic interaction, then all the energy goes from one thing to another. Human biology. Where does the law of conservation of energy come in? I'd probably go to eating food. I wouldn't worry about what the whole excretory process. But yeah, your body is essentially just a giant energy converter. You take in food. The purpose of food the food has stored chemical energy in there. The majority of the energy is stored as sugars, and particularly glucose, and your body is designed to extract that sugar from the food and convert it into cellular energy. That is an example of the conservation as well, because your body has an internal temperature. Your body, that energy is used for kinetic processes. So even if you're lying in a coma there is still some kinetic energy being used in your brain with synapses or depending whether you're completely brain dead or not. But yeah, it's converted. The leftover energy goes into heat, which as a warm-blooded creature keeps you alive and you don't die. What about in earth science? What's the underlying earth science theme we've talked about all day? Not continental drift, but good thinking. I'm thinking more convection currents in the air. Climate processes. Climate processes are an example of law of conservation of energy. You can talk about it as in plate tectonics as well, because the inside of the Earth can be classed as a closed system. But in terms of Earth and environmental stuff there, we're mainly talking about climate issues here. So by having excess greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we're actually bringing in more energy, and that energy is driving a lot of climate processes. Okay. Yes.
Did you say wind turbines are an example of conservation energy? Like the wind energy and
yes. So wind turbines, they do the opposite of what a lot of what we're talking about. They take the kinetic energy and turn it into electrical energy, and then potentially turn it into stored energy depending on where that electricity goes. Any time there's some conversion, that is an example here. Now, this last little bit here is another one of these sort of big ideas here. How can atomic theory be used to unify ideas? How is atomic theory? What sort of areas of science come together to make atomic theory? I've kind of alluded to it a couple of times. What area of science would you say atomic theory belongs in? Physics, chemistry. Atomic theory is an example of where physics and chemistry are merged together. Even though we class science broadly into 4 main areas, most real-world science is using bits of everything. So atomic theory would say basically is chemistry, but the discoveries made leading to modern atomic theory came from physics. And so in that case there, they're working together. And in this case as well, the physics drove the chemistry, and then the chemistry drove the physics. What about in evolution? Yeah. Evolution does have, it's mainly earth science and biology. Yeah? Genetics is essentially biology, but you could also say that because genetics involves a lot of interactions on almost an atomic level, that particularly the structure of DNA is governed by the laws of physics and the laws of chemistry as well. And that's one of the things, the closer you look at a lot of these concepts, the closer it gets to sort of your fundamental physics almost. Mathematicians would say it's all maths anyway. It's just all an algorithm being expressed in a macroscopic form. But the maths people are a bit weird. But theory of evolution. If you remember before, and I could have the name wrong, but I said Mary Anning, I think is the person credited with discovering the first dinosaurs. That came about from looking at geological processes. Most of our history of evolution of things in the past comes from geology. And those geological studies have led to basically the theory of evolution. Also, Darwin, you could probably argue that the fact that he traveled on the Beagle for 2 or 3 years, maybe used a bit of physics to get wind from one place to another. But yeah, Big Bang Theory. physics and chemistry. Big Bang Theory, if you remember when we were talking about Hubble before, Hubble used redshift. Redshift occurred because he was able to look at the light coming from distant galactic objects. And the chemistry comes about because he looked at spectra. Spectra are little lines in the light that represent atomic atoms. So we know the sun is made of hydrogen and helium because the spectral lines coming from the sun exactly match the spectral lines of hydrogen and helium. Chemistry and physics, again, combine together to give us an understanding. Okay, plate tectonic theory. Physics, earth science, you could also say a bit of chemistry in there as well, because the chemical nature of the mantle and that as well. But yeah, plate tectonic theory, the driving force there, which is the convection currents. Convection currents are a physics concept. You would have learnt about that way back in year 7 when you were talking about the way energy moves from one place to another. Radiation, convection, conduction. But yeah.
It's Earth and environmental science and geology.
Okay. Now, we have effectively one last little thing here. This is effectively the last little bit. This one we're getting through a lot quicker, so you can have a little bit of a brain break in a second. But let's have a look at this here. This is a pretty big question. How have scientific investigations of nuclear reactions decay change the way in which the law of conservation of mass and law of conservation of energy are interpreted? You could almost answer this in one name. No. After Curie. Here we go. Einstein. Albert Einstein. One of the things there. Law of conservation of mass. Pretty straightforward. Law of conservation of energy. Also pretty straightforward. However, it was Albert Einstein who actually said, well, these two things are essentially aspects of the same concept. And of course, he did come up with his famous equation, E is equal to mc squared. Energy is equal to mass multiplied the speed of light squared. Essentially, what he worked out by looking at a lot of the nuclear decay and a lot of the nuclear radiation concepts is that these are just energy and matter are aspects of the same thing. You probably, and this is really late and high level physics, you can sort of talk about energy and matter being the similar sort of stuff. It gets even vaguer. It's just basically saying the universe is made of stuff and how you observe it depends on basically how you're observing things. Okay. And of course, if you want to work this out, this is year 12 physics stuff here. 1 kilogram of mass, if you completely convert that to energy, is 9 followed by 16 zeros joules. That's, I think, the uranium, the plutonium used in the nuclear bomb is about 1.5 kilos. So it releases a lot of energy. Now, that is pretty much it, guys. We're going to have a 20-minute break. You can go outside to the dirt patch. We'll be back in 20 minutes.